Is TV18 and you're watching CNBC TV18.
The revenue estimates were conservative. I think we can still manage around 6.8% fiscal deficit and provide something for the economy. Having said that, it is not the end of the world if 6.8% became 7% deficit, because time has come for us to step up the fiscal support to the economy.
Well, that was the outgoing president of the CII, Uday Kotak, making a strong pitch for higher fiscal support to the bottom of the pyramid, even if it means increasing the fiscal deficit. Now, that's easier said than done. Here's from the government's point of view. One, the government assumed a 16.5% growth in tax revenues this year. Now that is looking ambitious. It didn't look ambitious in Feb. The budget assumed nominal GDP at 14.4%. Now even that may look ambitious. 3, the divestment target was ambitious from the word go. 4, the government has already announced higher fertilizer subsidy and food transfers, which is an additional 40,000 crores that has not yet been accounted for in expenditure. 5, even with a 6.8% fiscal deficit, debt to GDP looks set to be above 90% for a good few years. So, can we afford to spend more? And then 6, the GST compensation is bound to be again large this time, which means the government will have to come to the market to borrow for that GST compensation. And finally, in spite of all of this, if we need more fiscal spending, should we spend it at the bottom of the pyramid, a social net, or should it be for stimulus so that growth answers a whole lot of problems? Well, to answer all these questions, I'm being joined by some top-notch set of economists. Joining me now are Aditi Nayar, President and Chief Economist at Aditya Birla Group, Aditi Nayar, Principal Economist at ICRA, Rahul Bajoria, Chief Economist at Barclays India, and Yamini Iyer, President at the Center for Policy Research. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We have an even house here as far as ladies and gentlemen go. Ajit, let me start with you. I put a whole lot of problems on the table, but you tell me, is there a compelling need to increase fiscal spending?
Absolutely, Latha, because the second wave was quite unexpected and nasty in its impact. And that's going to have a serious effect on the economy, which was not perhaps anticipated when the union budget. And that's going to have a serious effect on the economy, which was not perhaps anticipated when the union budget was presented on the 1st of February. So we must recognize that this is something which is very large, and quite a lot of it was unexpected. Secondly, the fiscal is the line of defense. It's right now, it's not, there's no other, policy like monetary policy or anything else which can be effective. And if we don't do it now, there is an immediacy to it. I mean, other measures will take time to work out. We need something which impacts the economy immediately, and fiscal has that potential.
Okay, but when you say fiscal, are you referring to, as Uday Kotak said, bottom of the pyramid? Or are you speaking about some kind of help even for the organized sector, payroll support or whatever, sectors like airlines, hospitality? Is that what you're thinking of? Because that will mean more spending, which can probably trigger the economy. What is it that you have in mind?
We have to do everything that will create employment, will create business for the small and medium enterprises, micro enterprises, and create income, generate income for all, especially those, not just the bottom of the pyramid, but the lower income. But remember, like for example, we have 63 million micro, small and medium enterprises, MSMEs. But those actually, if you leave out the, let's say, the retail, telewalas or, small services shops in urban areas, a large class of these MSMEs, perhaps 10 to 12 million, actually service large corporates. And they service, for example, the railways, which is a government entity, has perhaps 1 million vendors who are all MSME. So when you actually focus also on the well-being of large corporates, their health in turn enables them to give orders to the MSMEs. So it is not either or. Of course,
Okay.
it's you have to achieve this balance. But for example, remember when the restructuring package was offered by the RBI last year, loan restructuring, hardly any large corporates took it.
Yeah.
Because the large corporates thought that it's going to affect their rating. But so surely there's a lot of large corporates which are affected by the slowdown in the pandemic. For example, two-wheeler sales are down 40%, even below 2019 levels. And two-wheeler sales, by the way, are largely also have a large rural component, rural spending component. So I'm saying that of course we have to take care of the MSMEs and the lower, as Mr. Uday Kotak said, but let's not make it either or. I think we need to actually also address some sectors, not all, but some sectors in the large corporate as well.
Okay. Let me get to Aditi to ask her the counter view. Aditi, well, as someone who looks at sovereign finances, is there space? I mean, divestment, I don't think much will come this year itself, and tax revenues are not going to be as good as they looked or as conservative as they looked on February 1st. Where is the space?
Sure, Latha. I agree that the ferocity of the second wave is something that we need to address very quickly because it's demand which we think is going to have a prolonged negative impact this time around, and we don't think that the bounce back in demand is going to be as quick as what we saw last year. Having said that, the fiscal situation is by no means easy, but I would counter and say that it's not alarming either. And there's a couple of reasons for that. We've already got the data from Government of India, multiple sets of data which tell us that the tax revenues in FY21 are actually a fair bit better than what the revised estimates had indicated.
Yes.
They've told us that direct and indirect taxes were higher, and they've also told us that they gave more money to the states, which means that for Government of India, the net tax revenues we think were probably between 60,000 and 80,000 crore higher than what the revised estimates had factored in. And therefore, the growth which is actually required to achieve the FY22 budget estimates is now looking much better than what we earlier thought. We need a 10% growth in the gross tax revenues and just about 9% on the net tax revenues, which is, just a little bit higher than the real GDP growth expansion forecast that we have. We're still going to fine-tune our forecast after seeing the FY21 full year data, but we do think that GDP expansion in FY22 in real terms would be somewhere between 8 and 9.5%. So the tax revenue estimates really aren't looking very high at all, what was embedded in FY22 PE. Plus, the RBI has given a higher surplus than what was expected. This investment, of course, remains a big question mark, and I think that is something that will probably continue to delay any cuts in excise revenue. So that is something that we need to wait and see if there is any kind of confidence that starts coming through in the tax numbers to be able to allow an earlier excise cut, which could form one part of a demand stimulus.
One minute, Aditi. Couple of questions, counter questions. Whatever shortfall you have, I mean, whatever extra RBI may have given, I think they were expected to give 50,000 crores, they've given 1 lakh crore. That will perhaps meet this extra fertilizer subsidy and maybe a bit of the food grains. It just kind of counters that. It's not too much that is left. And then you have possible shortfalls in GST. I mean, there's hardly any consumption in April and definitely not in May. So I don't know whether the 1.4 trillion monthly GST of March can be extrapolated for this year. There could be a GST compensation shortfall and divestment. So, I mean, are we all that confident of revenues?
Okay, let me add one thing. On the expenditure side, what we have understood is that the Government of India actually was in a much more comfortable position last year, again, than what the revised estimates had indicated. So we think that they've actually prepaid a liability of the FCI to the NSSF that was actually due in FY22. Okay. We think that's been prepaid in FY21. So there's automatically about 1 trillion of space which we think exists within the FY22 fiscal deficit. Okay. And 40,000 crore out of that, as you said, will go into the fertilizer and the extra food grain provision. And some of it can also be used to enhance the NREGA allocation, which I'm sure now
will be higher because the demand will be there in all probability.
I think that expenditure space will cover the expectations that we already have on the higher expenditure for FY22.
Okay. Let me get first comments. 1 minute, Aditi. Let me get first comments from the others and then I'll come back to you. Rahul, I wanted to ask you whether we can service more debt. both Ajit and Aditi seems to think there's space, and Ajit is asking for both social net and stimulus kind of expenditure. We're already running at 90% debt to GDP. How much, if you keep on servicing, even this year, the percentage of interest payment as a percentage of the total expenditure is higher than what it was last year. It's going to be even more next year because of the debt we are piling up. Can we go on like this?
So I think it really depends on, what is the growth outlook, right? Because serviceability of debt is directly linked to how fast are we growing. And, the idea is that if your real growth is greater than your say, interest payments, then you will be able to pay it down. So I think from that particular standpoint, it really depends on what is the nature of the fiscal intervention and what does it do to improve, say, the medium-term growth outlook. But I think in terms of the sequencing of these support measures and the impact on the debt numbers themselves, I think it is a foregone conclusion that irrespective of whether we like it or not, our debt to GDP numbers are going to either increase or possibly remain steady in the most optimistic scenario. And so debt serviceability is here to stay for us. It will eat into the amount of spending capacity that the government of India can have. The only thing we can think about is, is there a way to sort of indulge in more productive spending, which sort of improves the revenue capacity later down the line, right? Not so much
right now,
in the next 3 to 6 months. I think it'll be difficult, but at least over the next, 1 to 2 years, we really have to look at our revenue sources. And here, I think, both a combination of privatization, a combination of maybe some tax reforms, and eventually we will need some tax increases as well, which will improve the visibility on debt servicing, and that is what is ultimately going to give comfort to rating agencies.
Okay. Yamini, what caught my eye about some of your work is that you also had a work, if I remember right, about a lot of hidden money locked with the government of India in various places. So can there be some out-of-the-box ideas to finance much needed humanitarian expenses?
Thanks, Latha. Let me, before I answer that question, just say two things to the sort of larger macro aspects of the conversation that we've just had. I think while it is important for us to be concerned with indicators of macroeconomic stability and particular debt to GDP ratios, we also need to remember that the only way that we will be able to get back on the growth track is to be able to ensure that we are addressing the health crisis that confronts us. There can be no investment to the extent that investment leads to jobs, leads to growth. There can be no investment when we are confronting a health crisis like this, and that means that we do have to spend on health, both on infrastructure and on vaccines. And absent demand, we are never going to get back into a virtuous cycle. So there is also no getting away from spending both on the bottom of the pyramid and at some eventual point perhaps looking at a fiscal stimulus for the middle of the pyramid. But all of this will only, the only way to address all of this is that if the government actually comes out, and this is the role of the central government, comes out with a midterm fiscal plan. We need to understand the government's perspective on the economic consequences of the second wave. We need to get a sense on a medium-term view of how we will be spending and how we will get back on to some credible path of fiscal management. Once we have that, I think markets will be all right with a little bit of excess debt, and we will be able to tide over, because without spending, I don't really see a way for us to get out of the crisis as we are in the present. Now, as you rightly say, the question of where will we find the money, there are innovative ways of finding money that go beyond the current conversation that we are having. The fact of the matter is that our public finance management systems are woefully inefficient. There is a large amount of unspent balances that are floating in different parts of government bank accounts all over the country. The CAG had estimated this to be about 1.73 lakh crores a few years ago. Presumably by now that number may well have increased. At this point, we need to look for increased efficiency in government spending and a certain amount of expenditure rationalization and redistribution, so that we are spending on the things that we need to spend on while other expenditures may have to take a hold. This requires us to do critical reforms like reforming the centrally sponsored schemes architecture and ensuring a greater movement of money, sweeping the unspent balances that are sitting in bank accounts back and putting them into both health and social safety net expenditure at this point.
Fair point. I don't want to give the impression that I'm against the spending. I'm just telling you where the contours and constraints are. But I take your point. I mean, instead of 30,000 crore, which was set aside for vaccines, if the government were to spend 50,000 crore, it will perhaps save 5 lakh crore in terms of growth, which we are not able to achieve because of restrictions. So I'm on your side when it comes to spending. I'm only trying to look for where is the economical way of finding that money. And we are going to do, we will do that. We will do that. We have to take a mandatory commercial break. Back in a minute with ideas of where to spend and where to find the money. In a minute. Welcome back. There is a chorus for asking the government to spend more, either at the bottom of the pyramid or to kickstart growth, speed it up, or both. And I have a band of economists, Ajit Ranade, Aditi Nayar, Rahul Bajoria and Yamini Iyer, discussing where the money has to be spent and where it has to be got from. Okay, let me get back to you all for ideas now. Ajit, you go first. If you have to prioritize not just expenditure, but even policy changes. 1, 2, 3. What do you want?
Well, one of my favorite ideas, I think, which is eminently doable, is loan against shares. Government of India has PSU stocks, and the current value of all the holdings of Government of India in the listed stocks that it owns is about 15 or maybe 18 lakh crores, given the state of the stock market. It can have a bilateral deal with the Reserve Bank of India where it pledges these shares bilaterally. So it bypasses the market, doesn't disturb the interest rate markets for a very low percent, let's say 3% loan against shares up to 10 lakh crores.
Okay.
And it's a reverse, it's a repo. So 5 years, it's a 5-year transaction. And in the meantime, there can be dribble sales of this very same stocks if the stock market keeps going up.
Okay.
So of course it's privatization by stealth, you might call it, but maybe not. So this is an idea I think worth exploring, and it is unlike automatic monetization because it's loan against. This is one idea.
Yes.
The other idea I just want to quickly say, as Yamini pointed out, when we think of the deficit, there are 3 dimensions to it. There's revenue, and I think I heard Aditi say that revenue might actually surprise us. There's expenditure, and we are pushing for higher expenditure. And there's quality of the spending. There are efficiencies we can get in there was an expenditure commission set up under chairmanship of Mr. Jalan by this government, I believe. The NDA, the previous. But I don't know how many of those have been implemented. I think there are ideas there which we can examine.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot for that. Now, Rahul, let me come to you. Where should the government spend?
So I think there are 2 parts to the spending story. I think in the interim, the spending focus has to be on the rural side because like last year, I think the guiding principle has to be that the government should support people who either have, lost their savings or those who have no savings. Okay. And so securing those livelihoods becomes,
1 minute. So
becomes the first priority.
What you are speaking of is humanitarian, social net kind of expenditure. Because terms of trade this year look favorable for agriculture. Farmers, at least those who have economic holdings, should be a little better off. You are referring to the lower level.
Yeah.
Okay, go
Absolutely.
ahead.
And at the same time, I would say, there's a risk that, because the health crisis is in the rural areas, if the sowing cycle, becomes impacted by it, I think there's a risk that we end up losing or creating a lot more distress at the rural level. So I think keeping an eye on that particular cycle becomes very important. Then there's the second argument of, boosting demand, which I think can wait at least in the near term. This is something to be looked at maybe closer to the third quarter or, closer to the festive season, when maybe after a while, a lot of, say, people in the middle class who have spent a lot of money on healthcare, or in a very short span of time, their demand is not going to bounce back no matter what we try, at least in the next 2 to 3 months. So maybe closer to the second half of the year, we need to look at stimulating demand conditions, but that is something that can wait. I think in the interim, because there's limited resources, we really need to prioritize, the welfare schemes. So I think both Manrega cash transfers, food transfers, stuff that is already there. There is a machinery around it. It's quick and it's quite effective. That's the kind of stuff that needs to get prioritized, at least in the near term.
Got that. So immediately humanitarian expenditure, social net expenditure, and later on demand boost. Okay, Yamini, I have a feeling you're going to say that the biggest expenditure is going to be health. My vote would be just like active vaccination, whatever it takes. But what would be your priority?
So I think that we absolutely need to spend on vaccination, but there is a challenge that we don't talk about enough, especially when we talk about vaccinations in rural areas, which is the challenge of vaccine hesitancy. It's not going to be so easy, and it's not going to be so easy not because the poor don't want good health or don't want to be vaccinated or are ignorant, but because frankly decades of neglect have meant that the poor don't trust the public health system, and therefore they don't, that the government will have to work very hard with the community to build trust, build support for a universal vaccination program to work in rural India. Urban India will be slightly different. So you will see, we do need to spend, I think we'll be spending a lot more on vaccination in urban India, but my vote for rural India would be more spending on health infrastructure to build that critical bridge of trust and for the immediate deal with the crisis of COVID surging across different rural parts. Related to this is going to be the urgency of dealing with rural demand. Let's not forget that one of the things that worked in the favor of the economy last year, despite the fact that it was profit-led and inequality widened, was that rural demand was on a steady-ish keel. That we are already seeing may not be the case. The latest CMIE data, for instance, is telling us that unemployment in rural India is looking quite high, almost marginally higher for some days of May than unemployment in urban India. So it does mean that we need to be thinking differently about rural stimulus. Manrega is important, but Manrega may well need to be supplemented with cash transfers, especially if work is going to be hard as a lot of rural India gets infected. So a much more robust cash transfer architecture will be needed, along with more expenditure on health infrastructure for rural India, with a somewhat different plan of action, I think, for urban. It means that we need to calibrate. It also, last point, that different states are experiencing both the health elements of the crisis and the employment elements of the crisis differently. This time round, states have been left to their own devices to figure out their best course of action. But if states have to spend on vaccines, on health infrastructure, and on relief support, they will be runaway debt, and most states are borrowing at market interest rates. So this is the time for the center to recalibrate the nature of fiscal support it wants to give, and it's actually for the center to take the burden of debt and give fiscal support through grants to states to be able to tide over.
Sorry, I'm really sorry, we're out of time. You get the last word. Aditi, you are the headmistress over here who looks at the government finances and see that it doesn't overdo. But I give you just a minute. Tell me.
Sure, Latha, I'm not going to repeat what everybody else has said. They've made excellent points already. I just want to add one point, pick up from where you left off. In terms of the actual revenue inflow coming in, April and May were not so bad because we got the very healthy GST inflows of activity in March in the month of April, and the lockdowns were staggered in the month of April, so even May has been protected to some extent. It's from June onwards that we see things starting to tighten up, and therefore, if we can actually expedite the GST compensation loan, which we think is going to be of the order of 1.65 trillion, that's the requirement. The gap between where we see the GST compensation requirement and the cess collections, 1.65 trillion. If we can get that money flowing quickly to the state governments, then we needn't have an unnecessary tightening over the next few months. And the states can also plan what they want to do at the bottom of the pyramid, for example, in terms of transfers that they want to get quickly out to the people that need it the most in this health crisis.
Okay, we'll have to leave it at that. This is a bunch of ideas, and maybe this once the government has to, gulp down a higher deficit and perhaps discipline and do more creative capital-oriented spending in the coming years. Ajit Ranade, Aditi Nayar, Rahul Bajoria, and Yamini Iyer, thank you very much for joining me in this chat.